Okay, well, welcome back from spring break, as we will now continue through the course. This next 4 weeks are covering AZ 104. So just as last time, if you are able to get the AZ 104 cert through those free trainings that Microsoft does, take it and pass the test, then you don't have to worry about this section. You just focus on the last section of the class. So this is part 3 of 4. After this cert, you will have your choice as to what cert to do for the last 4 weeks with the same exact way of you do it. You show proof that you completed it. You do your skill submission, and we call it a day. No final, no midterm. The skill submissions are those instead. So if you haven't done your skill submission yet for the first 2 modules, definitely get those so that you're all caught up, because we are starting number 3. And number 3 has 6 sections. And then after that, we move on to the last. So in AZ 104, I did not take every single section of it because some of this is repeat. For example, there's a section that introduces virtual machines. Well, we already did that, so there's no point in recapping that. There's also a part of fundamental of computer networking and fundamental computer security. These are things that are already covered in other classes or have already been covered in this class. So I am skipping over some of these things to make life easier. So in the first part in the learning path, we'll go through build a cloud governance strategy. This framework provides you with proven guidance to help your cloud adoption journey. It helps you create and implement the business technology strategies needed to succeed in the cloud. The framework consists of tools, documents, and proven practices. They include these stages: defining the strategy, where you answer why you're moving to the cloud and what you want to get out of the cloud migration. Do you need to scale to meet demand or reach new markets? Will it reduce costs or business agility? There are steps within that, like defining, documenting your motivations, your business outcomes, your case, and the right first project. Because you don't just migrate everything in one shot. The next step would be to make a plan. You build the plan that maps your aspirational goals to specific actions. A good plan helps ensure that your efforts map to the desired business outcome. Within plan, we have the digital estate, the initial organization alignment, the skills readiness plan, and cloud adoption plan. The ready is a landing zone or an environment in the cloud to begin hosting your workloads using things like the Azure setup guide, the landing zone, and best practices. Once you have that, then you can begin migration to the cloud. And then you can find new ways to modernize your applications or build new solutions as you go from on-premise to the cloud. And that'll be migrating that first workload, any scenarios, best practices, and improvements along with innovation. Throughout that process, from the plan all the way to adopt, you have the governance and management. Considering your end state solution, benchmarking, make sure that it meets your governance plan, managing baselines, commitments, and so on. Don't forget that billing is a huge part of this, and you can create one billing report per subscription. You have to be able to keep track of all the expenses. You need to figure out access control. You shouldn't just give everybody access to everything, especially in a production environment for an organization who's handling very sensitive information. And of course, utilizing subscription limits, since not every resource can just be used without any limit. We have covered this a couple times already, that Azure works by role-based access control with various scopes, including the management, a single subscription, the resource group, or single resource. You have various roles that apply to those, like observers, users managing resources, the admins, and various ways to enforce those. You can apply those permissions, as we already covered, within the access control. You want to ensure, as you're moving up to the cloud, that essential things are not accidentally deleted. So you want to lock certain resources to prevent any accidental issues, because it's going to happen. Tags are awesome, especially as your cloud continues to grow. It'll help you organize all your resources. Tags can help you manage costs by being able to quickly search for a specific tag and see the usage. Handle operations to see group resources and how critical they are to your business. You can classify data by security levels using tags. You can identify any resources that align with governance or regulatory compliance, like ISO 27001. And workload optimization. Being able to use these tags can help you to really pinpoint what's happening where, being able to quickly search through the cloud, for example. Rather than looking at everything, you can use these tags to help make life easier. There should be an audit policy in place. This will help, again, being able to, for example, do stock keeping of virtual machines, of the usage, of costs, of all kinds of ways that you can create various policy definitions, assign them to those resources, and review the results that come out. Initiatives, as shown right here, are a way of grouping related policies into a set. The initiative definition contains all of the policy definitions to help you keep track of your compliance. So things like SQL, things like OS vulnerabilities, endpoint protection, all those things can be defined and assigned to resources, whether that's a group, whether that's a specific one. You can definitely use and leverage the tags with policies together. We've covered blueprints before to define repeatable set of governance tools and standard resources that the organization requires. They help you scale up very easily. Each component of a blueprint is an artifact. They can contain either no further configuration or parameters that are configurable. something like this. And like I said, I'm skipping a couple of sections because we've either covered them already or they have been covered in other classes, so no point in wasting time covering stuff already. So jumping further to Azure Active Directory. Huh. The picture didn't load. Oh, look at that, it's right there. Ta-da! Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, is a cloud-based identity management solution. It helps internal users to access external resources like Microsoft 365, third-party SaaS applications, access internal resources like applications on your corporate network, and cloud-based applications. Azure AD helps you keep user identities and applications through secure features. As admins, you'll need to know how secure your Azure AD tenant is. There is a score that helps you see that. You can go under security in the Azure AD tenant and select Identity Secure Score to see it. The value represents how well you match the recommendations and best practices that Microsoft suggests for tenant security. It'll show you how you compare with industry average, with tenants of the same size as yourself. It provides graphs to show how your score has changed over time, along with what you can do to improve it. Azure AD and Active Directory are not the same. Here's a comparison of the two. With Active Directory, we just have Kerberos and NTLM, structured in forest domains and OUs. With Azure Active Directory, we have SAML, OAuth, WS Federation, and everybody is in tenants, which can be used with things like Microsoft 365 and other services on Azure. It doesn't replace Active Directory, but the two services can be used together. So the idea is that you could use the two advantages of both combined. You can use different features of Azure AD depending on the type of license that you have. There is the AD free, the pay-as-you-go, Office 365, Directory Premium P1 and P2. They all get the one that best meets your organization's needs. Ideally, you don't want to get just the most expensive just because it has the most options. If that's not what you need, don't get that. Now, once you select a license that you're going to use, you say which user will use that specific license. Within Azure AD, there are some new terms like identity, which is something that has to be identified and authenticated, like a user with a username and password. The account, the identity, and its associated data. The Azure AD account is one created in Azure AD. The subscription is your level of access to Azure and services. The tenant is an instance of Azure AD. Multi-tenant access to the same applications and services in a shared environment. The directory is an Azure resource that is created for you automatically when you're subscribed to Azure. Each of those directories represents a tenant. The custom domain is one that is for your organization. So like your organization.onmicrosoft.com. The owner role, who can manage all Azure resources, and the global admin, who gives all admin capabilities in Azure AD. This is the one that can reset passwords for all users and administrators. There are a couple of default user permissions that you shouldn't just necessarily keep as is. You should definitely verify that it is what you need for your organization. Some essential features, like this one, Azure AD B2B. This allows you to invite external users into your tenant. Your organization can then collaborate with external staff through the B2B collaboration. The external user will either receive an email invite that has a redemption link or a direct link. The user will select the redemption link to access the apps they were invited to. If multi-factor is set up, they'll get that multi-factor code, and then they'll be able to access the app, whether it's on-premise or in the cloud. B2C manages customers' identities and access. B2C can be used to securely authenticate a user to their identity providers. B2C helps monitor for threats like brute force and denial of service. Its steps are on the browser or a mobile phone. The user goes to the app they want to access. They'll complete their sign-in form. If credentials are verified and multi-factor is enabled, then the user receives a verification code. They'll give that code up, and then they'll be given access to the app. ADDS lets you add virtual machines to a domain without needing domain controllers. Internal staff users can access virtual machines by using the company Azure AD credentials. This can help reduce complexity from migrating on-premise apps to Azure. The steps for something like this are the organization will deploy its apps and servers in a virtual network on Azure. Azure AD Connect will sync the identity information between on-premise Active Directory and Azure AD. The company will enable ADDS on their Azure AD tenant. Then the apps and servers in Azure can use features like domain joining and Kerberos authentication. With Azure AD, you can manage apps, like thousands of the SaaS apps that are already integrated. You can give access or internal or external access through any device and location through this. You can also register custom applications that you're making, and even add apps that don't necessarily show up in the gallery that they already provide you. You can also add on-premise applications. Using the conditional access policies will require users to pass additional information before they can access an app to further lock them down. And of course, because everything's in the cloud and connected to it, you can also see who's getting access and when. There is the AD identity protection that'll automatically detect, investigate, and remediate any identity risks for users for you. Like an IPS already built in to help you out, since users are generally the first ones hit. There is a whole section for Docker, and it is definitely an introduction with not much hands-on. There are some information on how to spin it up in Azure. I also suggest, if you haven't played with Docker before, to check out this site on how to get started with Docker. So if I were you, I would do this first to get an understanding of how Docker works. And then secondly, do some of the examples that they have, because they have a lot of already pre-written stuff that you can just copy paste into test. So first play with Docker and then see the examples that they have for running Docker containers in Azure. Moving right along into part 2, creating Azure users and groups in Azure AD. The permissions and roles will help you control access rights to users or groups, completely done through roles, since Azure is in RBAC. You have those administrator roles that you need to be very careful when giving. You have the member roles. You have the guest users as well. So as you see, there's really 3 roles that exist: admin, member, and guest. You can add users through the CLI, through PowerShell, and of course, through the portal itself. Azure AD can manage who can access what by users or even by groups. So just like in regular Active Directory, you can say this specific user can open this file or this group of users, or you can make rule-based assignments for group memberships based on the user or device properties. If an external team would like to collaborate with an internal developer or internal developer team, the easiest way is to use the B2B, the business to business, so that those who are coming in from the outside are guests. It is the easiest way for folks to collaborate, internal with external, without giving them too many privileges to create any havoc. You can collaborate with partners through their external guest user identities to, again, give them access to only what they need and nothing more. Instead of using federation to add these external users, by going through B2B, you don't take the responsibility of managing and authenticating credentials of those partners. You can collaborate with them if they don't have an IT department or any other similar setup. You don't need an AD administrator to create and manage external user accounts. Any authorized user can invite other users, so it takes load off the admins. With a federation, you have to build trust between two domains. You have to set up Active Directory federation services. There's a whole lot more work at play, including setting up firewall rules and whatnot. That's not true when working with B2B and creating guests. So again, your Active Directory on site is not the same as Azure AD. They have two different things, but Microsoft would like you to use them together. Knowing that things rely on subscriptions, the billing entity and security boundary, you can use that to assign a default directory within AD to a tenant and ensure that certain users can only access certain things by their subscriptions. Since multiple subscriptions can trust the same directory, but a subscription can only trust one directory. Users in groups can be added to multiple subscriptions, allowing them to create, control, and access resources in that subscription. When you add a user to a subscription, the user must be known to the associated directory as shown here. If for whatever reason you belong to multiple directories, you can switch the current one with whatever one you want to work next in the Azure portal header, as shown the picture on the right. Creating a new organization or a tenant is not that difficult. Owners can create additional directories to support things like development or testing. Of course, you need to be within the Azure portal. You'll create a resource and select identity, and then select the Azure Active Directory. You'll give it a name. You'll give it the initial domain name. That'll follow after .onmicrosoft.com. And then what region you are doing it in. Then it'll be created. You'll be able to see it on the dashboard and see all the aspects of this newly created directory. You can view the users that are in Azure AD under Users and Manage. You'll see the columns that are shown by default. Typically, users are defined in three ways: the cloud identities, the directory synchronized identities, and guest users. The cloud identities only exist in Azure AD. The directory synchronized are those that exist on-premise in Active Directory. And the guests are ones that exist outside of Azure. In order to sync an on-premise with Azure, there is a approach already within the Azure portal. Number one, you have to be the user admin to perform this. So within the Azure portal, you'll create the new user. You'll provide the relevant information necessary. The default behavior is to create a new organization. So it'll be assigned, in this example, Alice at staracoustics.onmicrosoft.com. Select to invite the user, and they'll use their associated Microsoft account in order to be added as a guest user. And of course, you can do all this within the command line. Viewing the groups that already exist, there are two main types. There are the security groups, the most common, to manage computer access and shared resources. And there's the Microsoft 365 groups that have shared mailbox, calendar, files, SharePoint, and so on. You'll find these under groups, in groups under the Manage section of the Azure AD dashboard. A new AD install will not have any groups to find. So simply you can add a new group and you'll have the choices of security or Microsoft 365. The membership type field will either be assigned dynamic user or dynamic device. If it's assigned, the group will contain specific users or groups that you select. Dynamic user, you'll create rules based on characteristics to enable attribute-based dynamic membership for your groups. Dynamic device will be for a specific device rather than a user. So under dynamic, a user can be part of a group and then not be part of a group. Same with devices if it's dynamic. And of course, you can always go back later to change the membership as needed. Next. You can see all the roles that exist in the Azure portal under resource groups, selecting access control, and then selecting roles. A role definition is a collection of permissions. They can be anything from read, write, delete. A role definition will contain the following structure: the ID, custom, description, actions, etc. The actions and not actions grant and deny the exact permission you need. The data action and not data actions are all related to management operations for data. Again, it is totally possible to connect your on-premise AD with Azure. There is a free tool that'll let you synchronize the two together to build your hybrid identity system, from syncing services to health monitoring to federation, password hash sync, and pass-through authentication. Of course, connecting anything up to the cloud that handles your identity is something that should be planned, should be thought out. It's not something you should just trivially do. definitely plan ahead. Allowing users to reset their passwords will take a load off of admins and even help desk. SSPR, like I said, will reduce that load on your admins. It can work through the sign-in page through localization, like checking the browser's local settings. Verification by the user entering their username and a CAPTCHA. Authentication, where they add any required data to authenticate their identity, like a code or answering secret questions. If they pass that, then they'll be able to enter a new password and then get a notification that it was done. It is critical to verify the identity of a user before they're allowed to reset. And these are the many ways that you can have that happen. From a mobile app to email to phone call, however, to verify that that is the right person. In order to implement, you'll need a couple things. You'll need the Azure AD organization. You'll need an Azure AD account with global admin privileges to set up SSPR, a non-admin user account to test the settings, and a security group to test with. Under the Azure portal, you'll go to Active Directory, password reset. You can enable SSPR, self-service password reset. You'll choose how authentication will happen. You can specify whether users are required to register for this next time they sign in, and how often users are asked to reconfirm their authentication information, along with notifications to users or admins, and then any customization that may be useful. So we've kind of covered roles between Azure and Azure AD. Azure Resources and Azure AD have independent permission systems. Azure roles are used to manage and access to virtual machines, storage, and other Azure resources, whereas Azure AD roles manage access to AD resources like user accounts and passwords. Your Azure role is obviously RBAC based. That allows who has access to what resource and what they can do with them. It has all the built-in roles of owner, contributor, reader, and user access administrator. You can apply roles at 4 levels of scope: the management, subscription, resource groups, and resources. The Azure management helps you manage the subscriptions by grouping them together. The subscriptions help you organize access to the resources and determine how resource usage is reported, billed, and paid for. The resource groups are the containers that hold related resources for Azure solution. The resource group can have all kinds of resources that are being managed. The AD roles have their applications for users, passwords, and domains. like the global administrator, the user, and the billing admin. The main difference is what they cover, whereas Azure applies to the Azure resources. Azure AD covers users, groups, and domains. Azure AD only has one scope, and that's the directory, whereas the other can cover all kinds of things from subscriptions, groups, resources, and all that kind of stuff. By default, the global admin doesn't have access to Azure resources. The global administrator for Azure AD can temporarily elevate their permissions to the Azure role of user access administrator. That'll give them the RBAC permissions to manage any resources. So as the global admin, you might need to elevate your permissions to, for example, regain lost access to an Azure subscription, grant another user or yourself access to a subscription, view the subscription or management groups, or grant automation app to access all Azure subscriptions or a management group. So just because you're global admin doesn't mean you can do everything. And that's a good thing, that it's not one and the same for everywhere. Well, Azure has some default roles. You can make your own to fit your business needs. You choose the subscription, you choose the management group, the resource group, and the resources, and you can create it in the command line or through the portal to create specific rules to manage and do whatever you specifically need for your organization. Here it is through the Azure portal of creating a custom role, entering the information necessary, and then review and create to make it. Of course, you can do all this within the command line, including creating, assigning, deleting, all that kind of stuff. So like we said, the resource groups are any resources grouped up together. They have their permissions that need to be set in order to allow specific subscriptions to access them and use them. In the Azure portal, you can select certain resources to have access or to create as needed. You can apply tags to them, which will help, again, keep better track of the various resources you create. Easier to search for, easier to manage by having things tagged. You apply your tags to the things you create. And then we'll make searching for much easier later. You can create policies to enforce standards. For example, enforcing rules that the resources need to follow. And of course, you want to test out these policies before you roll them out into production. And there are ways within the Azure portal to test any of these policies that you set up. for example, creating a storage account, and it will say, nope, they're not allowed to create a storage account. It's just another way of controlling permissions. You can secure resources with using the RBAC function as well, on top of policies. And you can use resource locks as well to prevent, for example, the accidental deletion of resources. Well, accidental and maybe not so accidental. Now I must remind of keeping track of the costs. This is one great way to showcase the need or the benefit of going to the cloud, but it's also good to be able to keep track of the actual costs to, again, further cement either this is a good idea or a bad idea. And though ideally it should be a cheaper switch from on-premise to the cloud, you want to be able to calculate that, and there is a TCO calculator that Microsoft provides. Azure, just like any other cloud provider, will give you an estimate for the usage of a device or a resource that you create, but that's just an estimate. You have to do your own checking to see if you are spending that much or more or less. There is the advisor who will tell you things like, hey, maybe you need to turn off underutilized machines or switch to pay-as-you-go or whatever, whatever will help reduce the costs of using the cloud. You can create budgets. Under subscriptions, you can create cost analysis and set up budgets for the resources that are being used. This is great to, again, evaluate the usage of your systems, being able to see over time how much is being spent actually versus what is being forecasted, being able to make changes as needed, whether it is too much or too little, being able to quantify usage in dollars will be great for talking with the organization. Being able to see overall or being able to see by the days, this will be good data to provide to like the C-suites. And again, being able to see the forecast, the budget, being able to show dollar value to the usage is highly important. You can share and save the views that you create, as well as being able to divide it out for like annually, monthly, and so on. And of course, this data can be exported to be seen by others who don't want to access Azure, like let's say the business office. You can set up what data will be collected and be able to export that in things like CSV to be seen in other formats. Creating a budget is within the subscription itself. So you can set that and create alerts based on budgets that you create. So it'll tell you if you're overspending or what the situation is, depending on how you set it up. pretty useful, again, when talking with C-suites, being able to provide this information that to them makes sense and will again either add value or confirm the value of going to the cloud versus staying on premises. And you can view these alerts. You can have them sent via email or both. However works best to notify of what's happening. Second to last, moving resources from one group to another. If it just so happens that a certain resource is in the wrong group, it is pretty easy to move. You can see there are different types. Not every single type can move, but it is possible to move resources from one group to another. So check the types, because again, some are tied by whatever region they're in, or what other resource is dependent upon them, before you can move them from one source to another, or from one resource group to another resource group. This last section is device identity in Azure. The ways that you can control who has access to what can be through the three main ways of Azure AD registered. These devices fall into the BOID, bring your own device category. Azure AD joined, owned by organization, like a work computer, and hybrid, which is similar to AD joined. The devices are owned by the organization and they're signed in with an Azure AD account that belongs to that organization. The device identities exist in the cloud and on-premise. This hybrid option is better suited for organizations that need on-premise and cloud access. And this is supported by everything from Windows 7 on up. Conditional access uses data from sources known as signals that validate them against a user-definable rule base and chooses the best outcome based on the policies. They can be considered as if-then statements. If a user wants to access a resource, then they must fulfill the condition to complete the request. Conditional access policies are applied after a user has successfully completed first-factor authentication, like a username password. These policies are not a substitute for a first-factor authentication. They can be used to assess factors like device, location, application, and to assess risk in real time. Some of the common signals that are used are like the user or group membership, the IP location information, the device that's being used, the application, real-time calculated risk detection, and the Microsoft Cloud App Security. How many decisions are block or grant? This big old picture shows you the ways to create a conditional access policy. So you must configure the cloud apps, the users and the groups, and their access control. I might have skipped a page here. And this one, and this one. Oh, okay. The basics of Azure AD join. You can join devices to your Azure Active Directory without the need to sync with an on-premise AD instance. Useful for organizations that are principally cloud-based. Works on Windows 10 and Server 2019, but Server Core is not supported. This list is the identity infrastructure, and you really want to select the one that is best suited for your needs, whether a managed environment, like a pass-through authentication or hash sync to an SSO, federated environments, smart cards, or manual configuration. When you're deploying Azure AD Join, you have you have three main options, which is the self-service, requiring users to manually configure the device during the Windows out-of-box experience. For new devices, you can use Windows Autopilot to pre-configure Windows devices, or bulk enrollment that lets you set up a provisioning package that applies to a large number of Windows devices at once. And here in this chart, you have the key features of each approach. In the Azure portal, we can control how new devices are joined to the organization. Under the Azure AD, you'll have devices and device settings, and you can configure them. You configure the features to turn on with Azure AD Join. You can also you could also use a mobility provider, the NDM or ADM, and add applications that will be added to this. That way you could use any of these to connect your systems to Azure AD. Enterprise state roaming enables Windows 10 devices to sync settings with the cloud service. When it's enabled, it happens automatically. You can enable all applicable device users or select specific users. When it's on, their settings and application data will flow whenever they switch devices. This will allow you to separate corporate and consumer data. It has security because all applicable device data is encrypted, and all stored data will remain encrypted. And you can better manage and monitor, deciding who can sync their data from what device. This is available in the premium subscriptions. Things that flow from system to system are things like the theme, like the desktop theme, taskbar settings, Internet Explorer, of course, or Edge, passwords that are saved, language preferences, ease of access features, and other Windows settings like the mouse. In order to enable, you would go into Azure AD, Devices, Enterprise Roaming. You select what devices, and you select what members can do this. Once set, you have three main geographic regions where data will be stored. The country or region is defined wherever the Azure AD is set up and cannot be changed after the fact. Enterprise state roaming data does persist in the cloud until it's specifically deleted or becomes stale. Deleted data is kept for a maximum of 90 days. An explicit delete will occur when an Azure administrator acts on a user or organization or needs to request that a specific roaming data is removed from a user. And that could be the user deletion, the organization deletion, or on request. I am actually not sure if Mimikatz can extract passwords that are being used in Azure AD. It can take whatever passwords are stored in memory. So if Azure AD works the same way, where the passwords are hashed and are kept up in memory for the entire session and are visible in RAM, then it might be able to. But I am actually not 100% sure. But a good question. Any others? We have reached the ends of the slides. If not, no problem. As always, you continue through the parts, checking off any of the quizzes and knowledge checks and exercises in the section. You are always more than welcome to jump ahead. As long as you're doing your skill submissions or getting the cert, you know you'll be able to get through this class just fine. So any other questions before I stop the stream? Okay, seeing none, I'll stop the stream and we'll see you next Monday.